interview with Sarah Goldhagen, an architecture critique and author whose work explores how the built environment shapes cognition, emotion, and everyday life. She is the author of Welcome to Your World and has spent decades teaching in architecture schools and writing architectural criticism. You can read more about Sarah Goldhagen on our website, 6degrees.blog, and our Instagram page, 6 Degrees Away. Thank you and enjoy this video.
Everyday environments shape cognition, but I'm going to talk about important ways
Okay.
in which it does, and and then I can talk a little bit about what a non-negotiable criteria. So I would say that in the American context, the most important way. So you have to break this down to outside of buildings and insides of buildings, basically. So let's start with the outsides of buildings. There are ways that are very well known. I mean, basically, when you're talking about the ways that environment shapes cognition, it's always shaping cognition.
Mm-hmm.
It's shaping cognition from the point of view of it literally creates some of the structures that we use to think. So, for example, when you say, oh, I'm feeling really high right now, I'm walking on clouds, that's an environmental reference that people understand because they live in bodies on Earth. Or you say, that guy's not backing me, or he's behind me. That's a bodily reference. And so we actually think through our experience of living in bodies on Earth and the world. And those create kind of structural determinants of how we move through everything. Behind you can be scary, in front of you means it's straightforward. I mean, there are all sorts of metaphors and so on that we use to think through that come from living in the world. So those are kind of pre-given structures that we already have cognitively because, we're at the stage that we are in this life that we develop very early on in infancy and early childhood. And then there are the ways that environments shape how we think as we're moving through them. And that is mainly done unless you're really paying attention to design, which most people who aren't designers don't do. That is mainly done what I call non-cognitively, or non-consciously rather, which is that you're not really aware of the way that the environment is shaping the decisions that you make, but it is. Or you're not really aware of the way that the environment is shaping the emotions that you feel, but it is. So, for example, just to give an obvious example, if you're walking in the dark in an empty parking lot building, you feel threatened, or you can feel unsafe. And you feel unsafe because you can't exactly see around you, and there are corners that people can be hiding behind, whatever, right? And so you think I feel threatened, but it's the environment, which could have been designed in a way to protect you from those things, but isn't. I'll give you another example. I'm still talking about exteriors of buildings or urbanistically. There is a fair amount of research that shows that boring streetscapes accelerate people's stress. So if you're walking by a building that is pretty undifferentiated and doesn't have a whole lot of detail, let's just say, like, you come from Houston, you know what I'm talking about, like sort of glass facades, right? No scale markers, not a whole lot of planning going on in front, and so on. Studies pretty consistently show that makes people feel stressed out. Their heart rates accelerate, their cortisol levels go up. And there are ecological, psychological reasons for that because humans are wired to want stimulation from their environment. You want to see patterns that you understand, but you also want breaks from those patterns that engage you and stimulate you. So it's a difficult question to answer because uh, environments are always shaping the way you feel. You know, when you feel comfortable in an environment, you know, the way you don't feel comfortable in an environment. Sometimes, I don't, in fact, a lot of times, I think people think that, let's say, a certain thought that came into their heads is making them uncomfortable when in fact it's their environment, something about their environment. But because we're not really attuned to thinking about our environments as a part of our internal lives, even though they really are, but as something separate from our internal lives, we misattribute the origins of certain emotions or cognitions to being internal, from as internal when in fact they may well have been ignited externally. Does that make sense?
That's so interesting. It's like
Yeah,
the places you're in like subconsciously like affect everything you think.
yeah. I mean, I have a passage, a section in my book in which it's called A Walk in the Village. I basically take the reader on a walk in a certain part of the city. And um, me and the reader together, walk by really smelly garbage. And all of a sudden, you have like a series of unpleasant thoughts, but you don't really realize that it's because of the environment
Right.
made you feel uncomfortable.
Mhm.
So, um, all right. So that's exterior buildings. Interior buildings, it's pretty much more straightforward. I mean, we all know there are rooms that indicate that they're not meant to be inhabited for a long time. For example, corridors, right? A corridor is not a place you're going to hang out.
Right.
Why? It's giving you 400 signals through the design, through the width, through the lighting, uh, through the lockers in the hallway, whatever, that you're not supposed to really stand there and hang out, that you're on your way to somewhere else. Um, there are all these messages that spaces are giving us all the time, and we have inculcated so many of those that we don't even really realize that. But the thing that's important is that these are decisions that people made about, or rather, uh, didn't make but should be making about how a person should feel or what they would want, they should want to do, what they should be paying attention to in their environments. And a lot of this, particularly in the American context, is really done quite thoughtlessly, both on the exteriors of buildings and on the interiors of buildings, so that people are caused unnecessary stress, um, and or feel unnecessarily uncomfortable, or want to avoid certain places, and so on and so forth. Um, so I think it's a general answer, but I would now, the second part of the question is how I would translate these things into design criteria for street, school, and housing, um, which is a great question. Um, I'm going to take things one by one, actually. On streets, I mean, I'm saying things that are pretty obvious, but safety is obviously first. Yeah, I assume he's talking about pedestrians, or the question is related to pedestrians. So, um, safety is number one, but scale markers are really important because buildings are very big and people are not. Um, and the more scale markers that you have on buildings that allow you opportunities to imagine yourself engaging with it, even if you're not really going to go and touch it or open the door or whatever. Um, or imagine how it feels to touch it. It's called simulation in psychological terms, so that you can simulate engaging with this building, even if you're not
Mm-hmm.
really going to engage it, because we do that all the time. We're always simulating. We're running simulations constantly about, opportunities, ways we might engage, and so on and so forth. And like I think my answer is partly determined by the fact that I know you're sitting in Houston, where a lot of buildings don't have these. Um, but
Yeah.
in streets, I mean, so many of the buildings in downtown Houston lack scale markers. Um, and scale markers can be ornament. They can be planning. There are lots of different things. Um, and then if you think about, well, he asked specifically about streets, public spaces is a different thing, but I'll go to schools and housing. Um, I guess, if there's one element or two elements that sort of consistently across the board emerge as very important. The first one is, and they're related to one another. The first one is access to visible nature that you
Mm-hmm.
can experience,
Mm-hmm.
um, and natural light in a controlled way, in a positive and controlled way. And both of these needs are actually physiological needs on
Mm-hmm.
our part. Um, Nature just has these incredibly therapeutic effects on people. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, so one study I cite in my book was that if you have a hospital patient, no, everybody's stressed when they're in the hospital, right? Everybody. Um, if you take a hospital patient into his garden in the hospital, like a really nice garden, their heart rates will settle down in 5 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And their cortisol levels will be measurably lower within 5 minutes. Um, and, anything you can do to diminish stress um, in settings like that is something that you want to do.
Right.
Um, so, so views of nature, I mean, there have been studies on being in nature, on looking at nature, like standing in nature, but not interacting with it, on being inside a building and looking at nature, and on looking at representations of nature, like paintings or photographs or whatever. So
Mm-hmm.
you see what I've got here, right?
Yeah.
Um, um, and of course, being in nature is the best.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but even representations of nature have profound effects on
Mm-hmm.
people. And this is because, of course, evolutionarily, we evolved in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something called visual fluency. We're actually hardwired to be able to see and comprehend natural environments, which have certain levels of complexity, which can be measured
Mm-hmm.
um, much more easily and with much less stress than environments that don't have those mathematical and geometric properties. So nature is number one, natural light number two. For obvious reasons, I mean, we all know we need sunlight for vitamin D, right? Uh, but so there are a number of properties of light that humans find necessary and appealing. And so we're going on sort of the calm, engaged, uh, engagement with serenity. I don't know exactly how to is like a good state for a lot of things, right? That's the basic assumption. Um, Light attunes you to your circadian rhythms. So if you're inside a building, but you have natural light that's changing throughout the day, that's literally tuning you physiologically to your circadian rhythms in a way that's healthy for you. Um, the other thing about light that's really good is that it changes all day long, and humans are gluttons for visual stimulation. I mean, we love to look, we're wired to look at change. And we want to be engaged. We people hate to be boring. It's very stressful to be bored. Um, and so natural light, if skillfully used from a design point of view in an interior, and here I'm talking about schools in particular, just create what are called kind of micro attentional breaks in a student's day. Let's say you're sitting in a classroom and like a cloud passes over the sun. So like suddenly the classroom's a little darker for a bit and then it gets a little lighter. That just gives you a moment to kind of engage in the exterior, and then you come back and your attention is refreshed. Does this make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. And so nature is one thing, and the natural properties doesn't have to be actual nature. I mean, there was one study done in a school in, I think it was Maryland or Delaware, on fractals. Do you know what fractals are in geometry? Fractals are certain kinds of complex geometries that are found in natures. For example, coastlines are fractal in geometry. And okay, I can't remember the name of the broccoli, but there's that really cool broccoli that has a repeating pattern that spirals around that you can get in the supermarket. Anyway, that's a fractal. So fractals happen at every different scale, and they happen in nature, and we humans love fractals.
Mm-hmm.
So because of visual fluency, basically. So there was this school where they had two classrooms, and in one classroom they basically just put up wallpaper that had a fractal design on it, and then they measured the performance of the students in these two different classrooms. So one was like plain and boring and white, and the other had this fractal design. And the students in the room with the fractal wallpaper did better over the course of the year on their studies. I mean, it sounds kind of unbelievable, and people look at me when I say these things sometimes and they say, "Oh, really?" But we can measure these results, and it helps. And it's because we have evolved to want these things in our environment and to feel good when we get them.
Right.
Right. So, and I would say the same sorts of things that apply to schools also apply to housing, but there's an additional thing in housing, which is, I mean, it sort of applies to schools too, which is that people, of course, want to feel safe in their homes. And so housing needs to be solid and have bedrooms and so on. And people do best in housing that affords the inhabitants some degree of autonomy and privacy. Because those are places where you replenish yourself and you feel in control. So private bedrooms for each member of the house is a good thing. These are all things that some people intuit, but when you can see the impact of not having these things on people, I think that the general public will begin to value them more highly. So, private bedrooms, little spaces where you can go off and be by yourself, so on and so forth. Another factor that I didn't mention, which is important in all three of the categories that we're talking about, which is streets, schools, and housing, is acoustics. So this is particularly relevant in schools. There was one study of a school actually in my neighborhood where one set of classrooms looked out over the elevated subway,
Mm-hmm.
and the classrooms on the opposite side of the hall looked out on a quiet street.
Mm-hmm.
And the performance, over the academic year, the performance of the students who were placed in the noisy classroom was measurably, significantly worse, just because of the noise. Everything else was the same: teacher quality, instruction, curriculum, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So, okay, I'll let you ask me questions now. Let's see how we do.
So, for these studies that you're talking about, there are things that have been conducted just online that go with your your understandings, or
There's studies done by psychologists all over the world. I mean, some are basically, these are psychological, most of them are psychological studies. So they're conducted by psychologists in situ. And most of them are controlled experiments. So they use, they have a control setting, and then that way they can measure what the impact is of light, views of nature, access to nature, et cetera, on these various things. It's a new field, I should say. So most of the studies have been done in the last 20 years.
mm-hmm. And do you think there's any misuse of all of this science and all these studies that leads to people making poor design decisions when they do eventually go and create their houses or schools or buildings?
Um, I would say the field is probably too new to see that, because basically the field that we're talking about, which I hate the term, but most people just call it neuroarchitecture, which is not a term I like. I call it human-centered design, but it's really only about 15 years old,
Mhm.
and architecture moves very slowly. Buildings take a long time to build. And so these studies are, I mean, some of them are 30 years old, but most, very few of them are that old, and most of them are more recent. So we don't, all I'm saying is that we don't have enough data yet to see what's not working,
Mhm.
because not enough has actually been executed. And then after you execute it, you need to measure it.
Right. And what are the most, so I know we talked about good, but what do you think would be the most harmful urban typologies for cognition and social life?
Um, well, prisons are the worst.
Hmm.
Those are usually set outside of cities, but pretty much the way that prisons uh, are designed to harm the people inside of them. I mean, this is most apparent in solitary confinement. I mean, studies show that people who are in solitary confinement within the space of 2 weeks degrade cognitively massively.
Hmm.
Um, so, what other typologies? It's hard to talk typologically because it really depends on how well the building is done. I mean, any typology can be good or bad depending upon the design. Most of the time they're bad, but so I can't say like the school typology is worse than the government building typology or whatever.
Hmm.
That's a hard question to answer.
Hmm. Okay. Um, so wait, so tell me a little bit about your book that you were talking about. What?
Okay. Um, so in 2017, I published a book called Welcome to Your World: How the Built Environment Shapes Our Lives. And I had been teaching in architecture schools and writing architecture criticism for decades. And I found that designers, emerging architects, even clients felt very uncomfortable talking about uh, how they might shape people's experience of the spaces they were designing. And of course, talking about anybody's experience is a complicated thing, right? I wouldn't presume to know what your experience of the room that you're sitting in is, and you, same thing with me. So it is a complicated thing, and it is highly personal experience. However, um, we are gaining access to all sorts of information through cognitive studies about basic ways that people experience their environments and think. And so I wrote this book in which I used the most recent neuroscience and studies in cognition and studies in environmental psychology to bring together a framework for understanding some of the basics about how people experience their environments.
Mhm.
And that was the book. Um,
So what you just said is there's the neuroscience part of it, and then there's the psychology, and then kind of
mhm.
philosophy. Which one do you think is the most like important that architects need to engage with when going about a design or talking about their environment, and why?
Well, the neuroscience is pretty hard for most people to wrap their heads around, and I don't think um, I wouldn't say that the neuroscience is what architects really need to pay attention to, but I have been for a long time really surprised that there wasn't more attention given to environmental psychology.
Mhm.
Uh, and the methods are very different in these. And a lot of environmental psychology is seen as sort of soft psychology because a lot of the experiments are done by simply asking people how they feel.
Mhm.
And, that's seen as kind of not necessarily a very reliable way to get data that usable data.
Mhm.
Um, but we also know a lot. And there is pretty robust data. And environmental psychology is a much older field um, than cognitive neuroscience, actually. The cognitive neuroscience was useful because it basically proved that uh, what I was talking about before, which is the experience of embodiment and the experience of enmeshment in our environments.
Mhm.
So that, for me, that's why that was important. And I'll just ask you, do you know what mirror neurons are?
No.
Okay. So uh, about 15, probably 20 years ago now, some scientists in a lab in Italy discovered that there are motor neurons in our brain that, okay, let's say I'm looking at you, you're looking at me, and
Right.
you smile,
Mhm.
right? And I'm not smiling.
Mhm.
But just by my looking at you smiling, the motor neurons in my brain that fire when I smile will fire anyway.
Mhm.
Okay. So why is that? It's it's what I it's relates to what I said before about simulation. I'm basically imaginatively simulating how you feel and what you're doing because I'm looking at you.
Mhm.
So, okay, this is related, believe me, I'll get you there.
Mhm.
um, so the motor neurons, the mirror neuron studies came out, and I thought, since I work on architecture, that's incredibly cool. That's so interesting. But this was person to person, or in the case of this study, it was actually monkey to monkey. But monkey brains are very similar to people brains.
Mhm.
Um, and I thought, maybe is that also true for objects? So, for example, if you look at this is just an obvious way, if you look at a window
Hmm.
and you see the handle of the window, do you imaginatively simulate opening that window? In other words, motorically engaging in with that object, even though you're not actually going to open the window. And the answer to that question is yes. In other words, there's an equivalent of mirror neurons, which is about social cognition, um, to objects, and they're called canonical neurons. So that doesn't mean you're always simulating opening windows when you walk by a window, but it means if you actually look at it, you probably somewhere you don't even know that you are, but you are.
Hmm.
Um, and so this was the reason why the cognitive neuroscience was important to my argument and has been important to people who are doing what I do, is because it shows how incredibly enmeshed we are in our environments and how responsive we are to them without even knowing that we are.
Hmm. I think that whole thing is so interesting. And so our last question that we asked everyone that we interview is, how do you define success? And also, what is like the most important advice you would give to people growing up now?
Wow. I have kids. I give them advice all the time. I don't know if I can summarize it. Um, how do I define success? I could sort of say the standard self-actualization. I mean, sort of find things that fit with who you are, that you find meaningful and hopefully socially meaningful not only to you, but something that you believe is actually contributing to the betterment of others because we're social animals. It it makes people feel good when they're doing things for other people,
Mhm.
and do that thing,
Mhm.
and do it as well as you can, and see where it takes you, and keep pushing on it. That's what I've done anyway,
Mhm.
and it's led me to some pretty interesting places. I mean, the other thing about success, at least I'm using my own experience here, is that when I started working on this book, the Welcome to Your World book, nobody was working on this stuff.
Mhm.
And everybody was like, cognitive neuroscience and architecture? Really? Like, it just doesn't seem like much of a fit. And I was like, nope, I'm going to do this. I think it's really important. I think it's really interesting. And lo and behold, 20 years later, 15 years later, there's a field out there that does that.
Mhm.
Um, so that's my answer on success. And the most important advice, I suppose, I would give younger people, growing today. I mean, look, the political situation is so chaotic and frightening to me,
Mhm.
and to a lot of people. And then there's the whole issue of social media and digital media. And I mean, if I had to say one thing, I would say get off your phone.
Yeah, that's good advice. See, that's
So I guess that would be it.